Hello and welcome to today's webinar from IEDP Developing Leaders. I am Roddy Miller, and a big welcome to everyone who's joining us. We've got a really excitingly large crowd of people signed up for today, and I'm going to give a few more minutes, as we always do, to allow people to join. We've started at a slightly unusual hour, 10 past the hour, which is trying to avoid the internet surge that happens on the hour and sometimes prevents people from joining smoothly. So hopefully this 10-minute delay will have helped people get on more effectively. We are going to, I'll be introducing Jonathan, who's with me at the moment, in a few seconds time, but before that it was just useful to have a little bit of a think about today's topic around strategic alignment. We've been discussing a whole range of different topics in the webinars we've been running over the last few months, particularly during lockdown. And I think this is a perfect moment to bring up this concept around strategy and alignment. Jonathan, as he may mention, but I'm going to push forward anyway, has published this book, Align, last year, and is available in all good bookshops. But I was just chatting to Jonathan. It's been hugely well received and is extraordinarily readable too. Often these books require a little bit more effort, but this one unfurls in front of you, but it does also help bring together lots of the key ideas and concepts, and which is appropriate around alignment perhaps. But Jonathan, in the next couple of minutes, will also, well, in the next 20 minutes, will be pulling those key thoughts and ideas and presenting them to us, and we look forward to that. So we've got about 125 people now, and I think we should probably kick off because time is limited. So Jonathan, welcome. We've known each other for a good few years, but you are an associate professor of management practice at, I think you were the first professor of management practice at Oxford Saïd. And recognized absolutely with that close connection to the real world of commerce and industry, but always founded with that background in research and in empirical evidence. And I think that fits so well with what we do at IEDP, of trying to merge those two. So I'm delighted that you're here. I'm delighted that you're speaking on this subject. And with that, before I hand over to you, I'd like to just open the first poll today with everybody and get them to, and so we can get a feel as to how people view and engage with strategic alignment. So I'm going to pop that up onto everybody's screens now. That should be launching. There's distributing poll and in progress. So how much of your time do you spend discussing strategic alignment? So we've got about 70% of those who've joined us have voted. I'll give it a few more seconds and then we can review the poll. There we go. Can we get it up to 80%? I think we're about there. Okay. Let me close it there. And we have, can you see those results, Jonathan? No. You can't. Okay. Oh no, I need to share them. That's why. Now, hopefully, you can see the results. So 7% say they never discuss strategic alignment. Fairly equal on once a year and once a month, 16% once a week, and a diligent 7% do it every day. So with those statistics in mind, let me hand over to you, Jonathan, and you can tell us whether that's about normal or whether we can be improving or changing that.
Great. Thanks, Roddy, and thanks very much for the kind introduction. I think the results are really interesting, and I think they would be consistent with what I've seen in organizations generally. Just to introduce myself a little bit further. So as Roddy kindly said, my name's Dr. Jonathan Trevor. I'm Associate Professor of Management Practice at Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. I've been at Oxford for about 5 years. Prior to that, I was at the other place where I used to work with Roddy for actually almost 15 years. But I haven't always been an academic. Prior to that, my academic career at Cambridge, I worked in management consultancy, and indeed I've continued to work with organizations of every stripe and everywhere ever since. Really with that focus on doing applied research and trying to make a difference, both through research but also education as well. My abiding interest is on this topic of strategic alignment, which is the best subject in the world for a business and management scholar, but it's also the worst. The best because it encompasses everything, the worst because it encompasses everything. And it's an extremely broad field. What I'd like to do is take you through some core concepts, particularly as they pertain to this idea of enterprise leadership. And certainly what I look forward to is the Q&A. So I won't take too long, 15 to 20 minutes to go through, whiz through some ideas. And then I look forward to the debate around that. And indeed, the whole purpose of me doing this is really to increase awareness and engagement around this topic of strategic alignment, which I think is incredibly important, but actually underdeveloped, both in the literature, but also in practice, and perhaps our polling results also demonstrate that, so that you guys out there sort of embrace it and can be more impactful leaders as a result. But let's get into that. Roddy, I wonder if we can perhaps do the screen share.
That should be available to you now. Have you got the...
Okay, can everybody see that?
You need to... That's it? Perfect. Yeah.
Great. So essentially, the first thing to do is to try and define what it is that we mean by strategic alignment. My abiding interest always has been strategy and organization, and essentially how the two connect. And often they're treated both in practice, but also in academia as two separate things, and really they're not. Strategic alignment is defined quite simply as how all elements of a business, whether it's its market strategy or how it's organized, are arranged in such a way as to best support the fulfillment of its long-term purpose. And we use business here in the broadest sense: business of commerce, the business of government, the business of social enterprise. Actually, this principle of alignment and a strategic approach to alignment applies to all different types of enterprise: large, small, startup, mature, domestic, international, across all sectors and internationally. And what it really means is seeing that all enterprises are value chains that consist of core components. And these components include, on the one hand, at the very beginning, the enterprise purpose, its business strategy, its organizational capability, its architecture, and its management systems. The enterprise purpose is really the raison d'etre of any enterprise, the reason why it exists, the reason why it's created, and why it's maintained, and it articulates what it is we do and why it matters, why others should care, particularly outside of the enterprise itself. Our business strategy is our plan or our set of intentions for how to go about implementing or fulfilling our enterprise purpose over the short, medium, and long term. And that comes forward in the form of choices around what it is that we offer to market, whether it's the market for public goods or the market for commercial goods and services, wherever, to fulfill our purpose, how it aligns to our customers, who our customers are, who we want them to be, and how it is we differentiate from our competitors. We then move into organizational elements of our value chain, which is to say our capability, the things that we need to be capable of in order to implement that strategy, our architecture, how it is that we design an organization to be fit for purpose, how we organize our people, our culture, our structure, our processes, and finally the management systems through which we deliver the performance that we need to win on a day-to-day basis. So in some sense, this is the value chain that encompasses the whole of how it is that we think about our enterprise. And the point is here that it poses very considerable leadership considerations in terms of trying to understand the form and function of each of these linkages in order to be aligned. Because the essential principle is that the enterprise, consisting of these core components, these linkages, is only as strong as its weakest link. And the research would indicate absolutely, time and time again in every industry, that the best aligned enterprises are the best performing. So the leadership challenge becomes almost one of trying to work out all of the time, again, over the short, the medium, and the long term, number one, essentially, what is our enduring purpose? The second is working out the answer to, well, what are we trying to win at to fulfill that enduring purpose? From an organizational capability perspective, what do we need to be good at to win? From an architecture perspective, our organizational design, what makes us good enough to win? And then finally, from a systems perspective, a management systems perspective, what delivers the performance that we need to win? These are our fundamental questions at the enterprise level and all levels down that we need to answer in respect of the marketplace in which we are operating, and indeed, however it is that we define performance, whether it's financial performance or some other definition of performance, whether it's competing for market share or competing for resources, the same principle still applies. And these are the essential leadership considerations. And the major challenge is really, I think, trying to work out and indeed choosing the ideal form of each of these linkages in order to build and sustain, maintain the best fit for purpose enterprise that we possibly can. And we can see that when we delve into each of these linkages, that it's a hugely sort of complex process of decision making. Business strategy, for example, requires us to choose as leaders the ideal form of our product and service offering, the markets in which we choose to compete, the customer positioning that we adopt in order to satisfy buying behavior or to meet and exceed it, to differentiate from our competitors, to articulate it in some form of coherent branding that reflects to the world who we are, and that we make sure that we do what we say if we make those commitments to our customers, which is really important, of course. Those are all of the key ingredients of developing an effective strategy. But to develop an effective strategy is not enough. We also need to have the organization through which we can implement that strategy if we are to be high performing. So we have additional considerations. They include things like, what's the ideal form of our organizational capability? What's our core competency and how does it apply across our different lines of business, assuming that we have more than one line of business? And how diverse should we be? How diverse can we be as an enterprise in terms of lines of business or markets in which we compete or seek to win, if you will, in order to perform well? What's our reach and how far can we extend without overextending ourselves and potentially create risk or poor performance because we're simply not capable of competing effectively in those different areas, again, whether that's for market share or indeed for resources. And we have multiple choices there: efficient execution on the one hand versus systemic innovation on the other. Often they're uneasy bedfellows for all the reasons that I'll describe in just a moment. But when we come to our organizational architecture, our design of how we organize work, for example, to be good at the things that we need to be in order to implement our strategy, again, we have choices here. We need to choose the ideal form of our people or our workforce in terms of the composition of skills, behaviors, attitude, in terms of capacity, in terms of capability. We need to choose the ideal form of organizational structure, what suits us best in order to be capable in the ways that we need to be. Similarly with our culture, again, values and behaviors in terms of how they translate into how our people, our core people, perform their work. Similarly with our processes, our technologies, but also the shape and the size of our enterprise. And finally, onto our management systems, those functional areas through which we drive performance, whether it's our HR system, our IT system, corporate real estate and facilities management, finance, procurement. You can list a whole range of corporate functions. This list is by no means exhaustive. All of these considerations sit within this value chain, and it is the responsibility of leadership to choose what is the ideal form for each linkage and overall. And again, the best aligned enterprises are the best performing. And again, that comes back to this idea that the enterprise value chain, and every enterprise is a value chain, is only as strong as its weakest link. So right here, this creates the full domain, if you will, the territory, the map for which we ought to think about as leaders, our enterprises, the choices that we have to make, and why it matters that we make good choices. And good choices doesn't mean simply adopting what works for others, fashionable practice within the marketplace, or the types of things that you read in snazzy journals or see on webinars, not at all like this one, obviously, but actually working out for ourselves what works for us and overcoming some of the challenges and the potential trade-offs involved in those decisions, but equally making decisions based upon reasoned choice, systematic decision-making, evidence, and trying to be inclusive and participative about that process. So every enterprise is a value chain, and we need to make choices about what is best fit for purpose at each linkage of that value chain. And again, you know, the value chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And that becomes a really important factor in decision making, because we as leaders, when we start to think about this architectural perspective on our enterprises, are beset by challenges. One of which is around our choices, our choice around what type of organization should we be in order to be effective. The traditional perspective was that bureaucracy was the best, most ideal form of organizing work. And you can see a visual here to represent that. We had hierarchies of authority. We separated management from workers, and authority was concentrated at the top and least distributed at the bottom. And we split work up into different specializations. So the green triangle represents the distribution of, say, the workforce, many more at the bottom than at the top, but the red inverse triangle represents the distribution of power. This worked extremely well in environments which were stable because it allowed for control. And when we have control around the organization aligned to precise planning, predictions about the future, in that stable environment in which demand is relatively predictable, that predictability of supply led to really great outcomes. And a lot of what we experience today in terms of prosperity, but also functional organization, bears its sort of genesis in this model of organization that really was such a major change and factor in how we think about business and management. But in the 21st century, we talk about an alternative model of organization. We position it as the network. And we think, whereas the bureaucracy was very efficient, actually what we refer to academically, we need better language because I think it's quite wordy. The post-bureaucratic organization, we associate with innovation, and we see it as a network consisting of multiple nodes. Which are connected through relationships, which very much focus on connecting different actors and sharing that pool of expertise and aligning all of that behind an opportunity, be it a customer opportunity or a market opportunity. And the dominant discourse is very much that we are transitioning from the bureaucratic to the post-bureaucratic, or from the hierarchy through to this idea of the adhocracy, or this network-based organization. But actually, that's a bit of a fallacy in many respects. It's not simply the case that we're transitioning from one model to another. Actually, we shouldn't see this as a transition. We should see this as a continuum. And this is where it comes back to this idea of the value chain, because as leaders, we are confronted with choosing between actually these two competing models of how to organize, both with advantages and disadvantages. So a question I always ask the executives that I work with or my students, you know, of these two models, which is best? And the answer is very often, well, it's the innovation intensive network. And the reality is that's a wrong answer. According to our research, actually both are viable, both have advantages and disadvantages, but they take different forms, and we should choose the best, most appropriate form. So which is the best between these two? Well, the answer is it depends. It depends upon our particular context and what we're trying to achieve. And that's a choice between formal versus informal. For example, between hierarchy versus network, between centralization versus delegation, between control versus empowerment, between efficiency or flexibility, between, in some sense, the impersonal versus the very personal, between this idea that we have sort of concentrations of knowledge at the top versus this spreading throughout, between internalization on the one hand versus externalization. Lots of network organizations have very porous boundaries through which they transact work. All of these different principles are, like I said, perfectly valid and legitimate, but we have to decide which works best for us. So it's very much a choice. It's very much a choice. And the major leadership challenge is choosing which model is best, whether it's for our entire enterprise or indeed having multiple models within different parts of our one enterprise, in which case we're managing multiple value chains. In my work, I see a lot of organizations that have made poor choices for a whole variety of reasons. And that isn't me being critical, but it's me saying that alignment really matters. Thinking back to that value chain, they have, for example, strategies which emphasize efficiency because they're operating in a commoditizing marketplace, but they have an organizational form that represents this network, this flexible network, delegated authority, which isn't particularly fit for purpose for efficiency, but it's actually great for creativity. On the other hand, I've seen organizations which aspire to be highly innovative, to differentiate themselves in the marketplace, but then have an extremely hierarchical organizational structure and culture, a culture of control. The point is that we need to find fit between these different elements of the value chain, between our strategy and how we organize, ultimately in service of our purpose. And for that, we require a very specific brand of leadership capability. Leadership is absolutely the most written about and the most talked about topic in business and management and beyond business and management, but it's still probably one of the things that we understand least. And I'm loath to introduce another leadership concept, but something that we've seen in our research and in the thousands of executives and organizations that we've worked with in Oxford is this emergence, particularly in this context of complexity and environmental challenge. And I'm not just talking about COVID, I'm talking about a generally more changeable, more dynamic, more global environment, this requirement for enterprise leadership. And enterprise leadership really is the solution to how we resolve the misalignment potentially between those different linkages in the enterprise value chain. And really what we see there is a role for an enterprise level and enterprise-wide system architect or architects that are thinking about the future enterprise, that value chain set in the long-term future, 5 to 10 years, in the medium term and the short term, and are thinking about how we bridge the gap between where we are today, which may be fit for purpose or maybe not, and how we transition to ensure that we remain or become fit for purpose for the future environment, which is almost certainly often very, very different. And that really requires a number of different roles that we fulfill or that's required. First is to envision what that future looks like. When I've worked with teams, whether they're senior teams or change teams thinking about the future, often the default is to want to start with how we are today. Let's just try and understand how we are today, and then we can think about how we want to be different. Actually, I encourage them to take out a blank piece of paper or a blank flip chart and to really think about ideally what would we look like in the future. Forget how we are today. That's a key role of this enterprise leadership role for me, which is really very different from this heroic traditional role of the leader atop the hill, ordering battle and inspiring the troops. It's not about people management. Equally, it's not about simply just ensuring that strategy is well executed. It is that 50,000 feet perspective, enterprise level, enterprise wide, and seeing to the future and engineering what that future might look like, or trying to envisage what that future might look like as an ideal set of principles. How should we ideally compete in that future marketplace? How should we ideally, in principle, organize in order to be effective. What does our workforce look like? What should our culture look like? Before we even get into issues around how we actually change. We then go into issues around how it is that we think about designing for that future context, getting into the technicalities in respect of, again, our business strategy, but also organizational design and management systems, those functional areas. What, for example, does a great performance management system look like for us? We've got 1,000 options as organizations as to how we manage the performance of our employees, but actually very few options are suitable or fit for purpose. So what will work best for us in context? Once we've worked out or envisaged in principle what we should look like, once we've designed technically what that should look like, there's then a process around diagnosing the current state. Actually, how strong are we? How aligned are we? How different are we from where it is that we think we need to be? And then finally, actually engaging in the process of change, that realignment process, which really is around leading change. Again, not necessarily implementing change, but rather leading the change in terms of the narrative, creating that vision, communicating that vision, ensuring that at the enterprise-wide level, people understand the direction of travel, whether they're internal staff or they're external investors, stakeholders, partners, and even customers, and they can make sense of it and understand their place in it and are motivated towards making it a reality. That's the really important execution role, but actually it's not just about doing things right, but actually doing the right thing in the sense of this is what fits our enterprise going forward, and we have a very clear vision for that, and we have a process for change. All of these things require really important skills, and some of this is familiar territory, perhaps some of it less so, but in thinking about how do we develop this leadership capability to envision, to design, to diagnose, to realign, and to lead strategic alignment, we need to think also in terms of some really core skills, which I describe as multi-everything. So enterprise leaders need to be, firstly, multi-level in their thinking, capable of thinking at the 50,000 feet level of their enterprise, at the highest level, conceptual level, and all the way down to landing. If we imagine the metaphor of an aircraft, they need to fly high and then also understand how the plane is going to land, and all of the different levels that connect the enterprise, from the global market level to the industry level to the enterprise level, sub-enterprise division departments, teams and individuals, connecting all those different levels of perspective and aligning it and being able to make decisions, understanding how all of those different environments relate to the choices that we make as leaders. They need to be multidisciplinary. They need to know a little about an awful lot of things, but at the same time have also their core contribution, their core depth of expertise. So we often describe or see enterprise leaders as being T-shaped, which is to say they have a real strength of expertise or specialization in a particular knowledge domain, whether it's functional or otherwise, but they also understand other domains so they can make those valuable connections across them and, again, operate on that enterprise-wide, enterprise-level basis. They're multi-spatial, sorry for the buzzwords, but what that means is that they have no geographical bias in their decision-making. They can see the enterprise in its full term, holistic terms, not just in terms of where it's come from or where it operates, but where it should operate. And they can operate on that almost global basis in their decision making, so that the decisions they make are always sensitive to the context in which they're trying to perform, or the enterprise is trying to perform and create value. They should be multi-stakeholder. They should be able to factor in the different potentially competing interests of all of the enterprise stakeholders into their decision making and find a pathway through to political alignment, if you will, politics with a small p, or unity, to ensure that we have maximum engagement both internally but also externally. And again, you know, customers are a key part of that, as equal and certainly as much as our staff. Finally, they should be multi-phased. Again, being able to think not just about the short term and our short-term performance requirements, but also the medium term and the long term. That requires discipline, I think, in two respects. One is to resist, you know, the immediate requirements of our business and to carve out the space and the time in order to think about the long term. But when thinking about the long term, to actually have that coherent system of thought and language to think about our strategy, to think about how we should organize in a disciplined way, in an evidence-based way, in order to lead from the front, and to be visible in that process of doing so. So it's really hard to, on the one hand, resist short-term performance pressure, on the other hand, to make conversations about the future, and especially the long-term future, not just speculative. So these really are all of the kind of the skills and the capabilities to fulfill those roles that are really essential, or an essential part of leading that strategically aligned enterprise. And again, the best aligned enterprises are the best performing. I'm going to come to a close now, but just as an invitation to you, because this is a real rush through the material, and I'm very conscious of that. This is a personal invitation. If you wish to learn more, here's my email address, and you're very welcome to email me personally, and I will respond and direct you towards more information if I can. And equally here are also some of our resources. We'll make sure that these slides are available to you post-webinar. But Roddy, I think I've probably spoken enough for the moment. I'd be really keen to get to Q&A and get a great discussion going.
Fabulous. Thank you, Jonathan. Well, as you said, that was you packed a lot in there. There was a lot of content, and appropriately, there are a good few questions coming through in any case, to start unpicking that and exploring that in a bit more depth, and we'll do that. But I've got a couple of questions first. I mean, just on the general sort of overview of, if alignment is such an obvious thing to do, I mean, how much are you seeing it happen, and if not, why are organizations struggling to do it more so?
The thing, it's a great question. The thing I find often in the conversations that we have, whether it's with research subjects or executive students, even our MBAs, or for that matter, consulting clients, is that yes, it's obvious now that you've explained it, but actually, when we're in executive positions, we don't necessarily naturally think in alignment terms. And you see that in a variety of different aspects. One is business as usual often mitigates against adopting these or having the time or the urgency for these more abstract, long-term conversations and decisions about the future. Equally, I think, when I presented that value chain before on a cross-functional basis in a large multinational, I won't say who, but just as an example, we had folk from HR in the room, IT, facilities, from strategy, from operations. We had all sorts of different leadership functions represented. And what the really interesting reaction was, well, gosh, that's the first time that we're seeing anything that actually makes sense of how we all fit together. And I'm not saying that to blow the trumpet of the concept. The point is that, we have multiple different leadership groups operating side by side, without necessarily having that one coherent system of thought or framework by which to come together and have a shared conversation about the whole of the enterprise, its direction and its current state, and the state of its alignment. So I think there's a variety of different factors. One is business as usual, i.e. the day job of just performing and delivering in a very tough environment gets in the way. I think secondly, we don't have necessarily that framework to have those joined up leadership conversations that we need. But probably the biggest factor is just simply, I think people generally are not aware of the importance of alignment and the fact that it really is the difference in many cases, all things being equal, between successful enterprises and everybody else. And we see that consistently time and time again. The best aligned enterprises aren't just the best performing, or rather, if they're the best performing, it's because they're the most engaging, the most resilient, the most prepared for the future, the most change ready. We see that again and again. So alignment for me is kind of the missing ingredient in how we make our organizations succeed. And we should really want them to succeed, whether it's a commercial company or a hospital. It's all part of, our social and economic well-being.
I mean, it presumably gets sort of more and more difficult on a sort of logarithmic type scale the larger the organization is. I mean, I know that in Daimler they they run new projects on a swarm, what they call their swarm basis, where they do bring people in from lots of different parts and departments around the organization to work on a single project, so it is coherent and aligned. But trying to do that on a much more organizational basis is going to be considerably more of a challenge.
I think that's exactly right, and for sure, one can have pockets of high alignment within a large enterprise. Really, for me, strategic alignment means that we understand the importance of alignment at the enterprise level and all of the different parts that make up the enterprise. And in an aligned enterprise, the whole is worth more than the sum of the parts. That's really important. And that because we understand the importance, we as leaders adopt a strategic approach. There's a really good question to ask is, who are the enterprise leaders? And the answer is they're not necessarily always the most senior folk in the organization, whether it's a company or a charity or a government department. The answer to that is, I'm afraid, kind of rather frustrating. It depends. If I looked at a commercial organization, one that I very much admire, and everyone who's ever worked with me will know this, McDonald's, an example of a highly aligned enterprise, really good at what it does and has been, market leader for an awfully long time, precisely because they've made those decisions and really embraced that bureaucratic work model and found that alignment, those alignment of principles across its strategy, which is all about maximizing economies of scale, and its organization, which is really that formal bureaucratized process. And I mean bureaucracy is a compliment there, not a negative or an insult. There, you would expect centralization of those choices, of that decision making. Enterprise leadership really means headquarters. When you get into, I think, more network-based organizations, necessarily that enterprise leadership role becomes more diffuse, and it can exactly be the creation of teams which are tasked with that envisioning, designing, diagnosing and realigning role. And I'm thinking particularly of a Japanese client that I've worked with for a long time. They have a dedicated team internally, which is formed of talent from across the business, precisely to almost operate as that task force focused on alignment for the whole of the enterprise, and then to serve ultimately the executive sign-off body. So that for me is sort of our approach to enterprise leadership varies, but I think you are exactly right. The more complex we are as an enterprise, which is, say, our size, the larger we are, the more diverse we are in terms of our lines of business, and the more geographically spread we are. Yes, complexity is in some sense almost the enemy of alignment. So simplicity is always best. However, if you can be complex and aligned, that's real competitive advantage. And that, again, comes down to the quality of leadership, and in particular, enterprise leadership.
Well, I mean, that enterprise leadership bit is really interesting, because I mean, it's a mindset as much as a capability, isn't it? You've got to be able, your radar has to be that expansive. I mean, you mentioned the T-shape, but you've got to be casting the horizon as well as understanding the immediate, and that's both in a time sense as well as a breadth of responsibility sense.
Absolutely, and it's not just about being good with people. In fact, talking about some of the examples that I've worked with, enterprise leaders in those examples, and these are real life examples, have zero contact with people. They're not responsible for implementation. They are the system architects. So really they are at that level of principle, working out the enterprise of the future, and the requirements for change from its current state in order to become better aligned. Implementation is done elsewhere by the people managers. So we need to understand this as a leadership function, but that's different from our traditional conceptions.
And that's a perfect introduction to some of these questions that we've got coming through. So let's move on to those. I got one here from Ivy, which was from early on in your presentation, but she says, how do you differentiate between organizational capability and organizational architecture? And I think you've just referenced that, but it'd be useful to just see if we can get a real clarity there.
For me, I think I think it's a great question to ask, and in many respects, organizational capability is in that value chain the missing link often. We spend a lot of time focusing on strategy. We spend a lot of time focusing on organizational architecture and design, but we often neglect the capability part. And for me, capability is the outcome of our organizational design choices. But organizational capability really articulates what it is that we need to be good about, or good at, in order to implement our business strategy. So if our strategy on the one hand emphasizes winning, competing well through maximizing economies of scale, then our capability requirement is for efficient execution. And that in turn sets the criteria for our organizational design choices. And often I found that without that context, without that link preceding organizational design architecture, we don't have that guiding set of criteria by which we can start to differentiate between our organizational choices. What, for example, is the appropriate strategy for our enterprise in terms of, is it hierarchy, or should it be something which is flatter and more network based? In terms of culture, do we want to emphasize an internally facing culture, a close focus on process, close cooperation, teamwork, or are we looking for something which is more externally facing, something which is more rooted in the external market and less inwardly looking? And again, neither is better or worse, they're just different, and each has advantages and disadvantages. If, for example, our business strategy requires customer agility, or rather requires that we're focusing on how we respond to different customer requirements, even down to the level of personalization, then that hierarchical, structured, process-driven, routine approach in terms of our design of organization simply wouldn't work, because our capability requirement becomes customer agility. How can we be maximally agile around our customers? And how then do we appropriately design our enterprise in terms of how we organize it? So that for me is really the very big difference. Connecting strategy and organizational design, but through this lens of capability. And the capability resides in the organization. It doesn't go with employees. It's something which is retained as almost our signature source of sustainable competitive advantage. And if we're developing a core capability, a capability that potentially can apply across multiple different lines of business, that really does become something which is unique to the enterprise that competitors will find hard to emulate.
Excellent. Okay. The question here from Marlo, and it references back to that slide, that first slide, I think, of yours with the links between the different elements. He says, how would you assess which of the links you mentioned is actually the weakest in a globally complex organization, and which of those approaches do you recommend?
I think it's a great question. I think it's a very practical question. I mean, there is a detailed methodology that sits behind that value chain that we can use to almost forensically examine each and the degree of fit or alignment in order to assess which really is the weak link and what is the impact then on performance. But I think, before you even get to that very sort of detailed methodology, the first thing to do is that I find often really helps, and just being very practical about this, is to convene the team, whomever the team is, and to use the framework to A, ask a series of questions, B, structure the conversation, I have a better conversation, and then C, in principle, make choices for each of those. And whether it's qualitative or quantitative in terms of the methodology I almost described, it's just very, very detailed. Actually, it will jump out where the weak link is. It will jump out where it's not working. So the first thing, order of business, is to just have the alignment conversation, but to do so in a structured and disciplined way, to think really hard about our purpose. Are we articulating it in the clearest possible way? Does it set the criteria by which we should think about the other linkages in the value chain? And do people understand it, and are they motivated by it? to think about our strategy, what it is that we're trying to win at, whether it's, again, market share or competition for resources, what's really strategically important to us, what are our priorities, but then to also think about how we organize and the different elements of that, and to stress test it, to gather opinions. One of the really interesting, I think, results that we see again and again is when you start to think about the value chain of the future versus the value chain of today, there's nearly always high team alignment about what the value chain of the future should look like. Where people disagree on is what does our value chain look like today? So it's interesting, different team members come to the same conversation about the present day with competing assumptions, with different views, even about the realities that they share on a day-to-day basis. That is a form of misalignment, and that becomes enterprise misalignment, for sure. So we think much more coherently and collegially about the future than we do about the present day, and we wonder why change often doesn't work.
Great, thank you. I mean, we've got a question here from Ian, and it's sort of it's around culture. Doesn't alignment involve building an inclusive culture where everyone's diversity is valued and respected? And I suppose the implicit question there is, if you don't have an inclusive culture, how is possible is alignment to achieve?
Again, unhelpfully, I'm going to say it depends. For sure, it's de rigueur to say that participation and inclusive decision making is kind of the order of the day, and I think probably for many organizations that's true. But when you start to think about all organizations and all types of organization on a global basis, those principles, they start to seem not necessarily best fit for purpose. I think it really depends upon the complexity. The more complex our business needs to be, because our environment is complex, the more we need to rely upon the wisdom of the crowd, internally and probably externally as well. And that absolutely is a requirement for participation, for diversity of background and experience and expertise and knowledge, but also inclusive decision making. Where we have something very simple or something which is repetitive or routine, actually where we know what good looks like in advance because it's something established, then actually the requirements for that wider participative decision making, I think, go down in the interest of efficiency. So take a production of an iPhone, for example. For sure, the initial design of the production process by which it's manufactured, a great deal of thought went into that. But once that's worked out, then it becomes essentially a systematized process. And you would not expect to see a great deal of participation and inclusion in decision making on the production line in Shenzhen at Foxconn for the iPhone that we all use on a day-to-day basis. So again, it depends. And I think the danger is that we embrace one-size-fits-all principles, potentially when they are inappropriate for the context in which we're operating. So my own personal preference is always participation and inclusion, but that probably reflects the type of knowledge work that I do as a business school academic and consultant. But our work and how we work isn't necessarily representative. So we really need to be careful about the context and the nuance that we bring as leaders to how it is that we create that fit for purpose enterprise.
Brilliant. Now, Jonathan, we've got a sort of follow-up poll, which you and I discussed beforehand, which I'm keen to run before we end, and I think I'll do it just now. We've got some more questions afterwards, so let me just see if we can launch this poll, which is builds on the one earlier. Yeah, how often do you think you should talk about strategic alignment? Now, having listened to Jonathan, so it'll be interesting to see how the the figures vary from how we had it last time at the outset, almost an hour ago. We got about 55% voted so far. Let's see if we can get it up to over 70. Okay, I'll give it a few more seconds and then we'll close it. And there we go, 75. Ooh, excellent. Last chance. And we close it there, and I'll share it. So it should be on your screens now. So the once a year figure, I think, has gone down. Once a month's increased. Once a week has increased, and every day has indeed increased. So 50% once a month, 23% once a week, and 17% every day. You have a reflection on that, Jonathan?
Well, I mean, yeah, gosh, I'm really delighted, and great polling question, and thanks to everybody for completing it. But if I compare the results, if I wrote these down correctly, Never was 7% in terms of what we do currently. We're saying that we should 0 for the new result. 38% had a yearly conversation. Actually, that should only be 10%. Monthly was 33 versus 50. Weekly was 16 versus 23. And every day was 7 versus 17. So basically, the message that I'm hearing from the participants is actually we should be talking about strategic alignment far more than we are, and more frequently. I'm really delighted to hear that. And again, I think it's down to this awareness of the importance of alignment, and actually that adopting a strategic approach to alignment, and not just treating it as something which is accidental, or you know, ideally we're aligned by luck. It just doesn't happen like that. It only happens through reasoned, rational, systematic, but also empathetic decision making at that enterprise level. And I think it's a great opportunity for us. And it's not something that we should just leave for the board. Actually, it's, you know, part of our fundamental career. It's how we as leaders, as individuals, but also collectively make a difference, because our organizations, our enterprises performing well, it is absolutely fundamental to all of us. Again, whether it's a commercial enterprise or a public sector enterprise, all really important.
Fantastic. I mean, there's an interesting question here from Erica, and I'm keen to, in the last few minutes, get a couple more questions in. But it may play absolutely to, you know, to what you were just saying there, which is, do you find that sometimes executives believe that they're aligned, however the rest of the organization disagrees? She goes on that, but I mean, the closing statement is, how do you get the execs to move and not just perpetuate their own beliefs?
Yeah, so the answer is a great point and great question, and the answer is yes, all the time. But I would also counter that with saying that ultimately, in a competitive marketplace, whether it's market share or thinking about social enterprise or governmental enterprise, competition for resources, in a competitive marketplace, ultimately it's the market, it's customers that choose whether or not an enterprise is aligned. If we are misaligned with the marketplace, if we don't deliver on our promise to customers, then the results become very clear very quickly, and there is a selection process. Poorly aligned or even misaligned enterprises are selected out of the marketplace, or at the very least they are you know, the low performing enterprises. Equally, we can have enterprises which are highly aligned but for a short period of time. The real focus, I think, for strategic alignment is how do we sustain alignment over time, over the long term, in a changing environment as we go through change. So it's not a one-off deal. It's not something that you achieve and then you can sort of sit back and you know, enjoy a cup of tea. No, it's a constant leadership pressure. The third thing I'd say, and this really comes to the point that was raised, the majority of the leadership teams that I've worked with at the top of organizations, they're not insensitive to the alignment challenge. It's rather they, you know, struggle with the complexity of governing, thinking about, designing complex organizations fit for the future. I don't want to say, because it's a very sort of corny term, but it's lonely at the top. it's lonely at the top. And I think often the uncertainty that pervades boardrooms often mitigates against that sense of alignment, or how we create that alignment. So I think, to the point that was raised earlier about participation and inclusion in decision making, I think, if it's appropriate for the business, and I think in many cases it is, particularly the types of organisations that are participating on today's call, then for me, the average executive that I've met would typically welcome more opportunity, because actually their job is really hard. But yes, becoming removed from it is always a risk.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I'm going to bundle two questions together here because they're sort of coming from the same angle, although they deal with two different groups of people. One from Jocelyn asks, for government bodies, most of the strategies are defined by politics. So how do you think alignment can be created with a 5-6 year turnover in this sector? And then we've got a similar kind of question, which hopefully I can find here, from David, who said he's experienced that many HR leaders struggle to engage in alignment strategically. What are your views on helping HR professionals to step up effectively to contribute to alignment? These bodies, which are sort of not necessarily instrumental in strategy or long-term strategy, I realize they're both completely different, but given time, I wondered whether you could come up with a compact answer, Jonathan.
Yeah, well, I'm just very conscious of time, so I will be quick with my response. So in my work, I work with many different types of enterprise, multinational, commercial organizations, big brand, household names, but equally with a lot of government departments. Often the difference or the distinction that we would make in working with public sector organizations, whether they're central government or local government, would be that really politics pertains to policy, defines the outcomes that are expected of the governmental body. I think there is a role at the government enterprise level to strategize around how to go about fulfilling that policy requirement, and that requires its own business strategy in that respect, and then furthermore the creation of an organization capable of implementing it. And if I think about a particular governmental body that's close to my heart, it's a local government organization, has a budget of here in the United Kingdom, has a budget of over £2 billion per year, employs over 10,000 officers, and serves one of the most economically and socially diverse regions of the United Kingdom in terms of wealth, educational attainment, and has 1.4 million customers effectively as citizens. The real focus for strategic alignment then for them is understanding that policy environment as set down by politicians both at the central and the local level, but then devising their own organizational strategy and design in order to implement that, and being sensitive to their incredibly diverse customer base, operating within resource constraints, prioritizing their offerings to market, and then building that resilient and high-performing organization to deliver it, and changing constantly with a changing environment. Actually, I would say that's a similar argument for the second question, which is around the contribution of HR. In both cases, what's required is, I think, a system of thought, which I call strategic alignment, but there are others out there, of course, but also a language and evidence to go about influencing stakeholders. Stakeholders in the case of government department are local politicians, central government, but also central policy decision makers, partners, but then also selling that narrative to customers. Similarly, from a functional perspective, such as the HR function, it's again about having that coherent system of thought, having that language for influence, but also going with evidence. I've never seen a case where something's been rejected out of hand that's contrary to the evidence being presented. Decision makers of all colours, all hues, all functions, all varieties of seniority respond to evidence. So again, thinking about alignment in that more systematic way, putting meaning behind the terms that we use, which otherwise are just a bit buzzwordy. How we create that influence is evidence. So that would be, really for me, the kind of one of the key takeaways from this. how to think more structurally, how to think more strategically about alignment, but also how to argue more persuasively for it, both in terms of narrative, but actually going with the evidence to prove the case, and to try and excite change.
Wonderful. Well, I mean, we've got loads of questions here, and we are out of time. So, but what has become very clear through the last hour is, you know, that the depth of information here, and the opportunity to explore it both conceptually, but also I think within everyone's own spheres of experience. I know that you have got a online program coming up later in the year, one of Oxford's increasing array of online programs, which you do in collaboration with Get Smarter. So for people who want to find out more and have been intrigued and catalyzed into thinking around this, this is an opportunity. The URLs to click on are on your screen now, and the Oxford online experience is a very different one from most e-learning experiences. There's discussion forums and 24-hour support, and it's a very intensively managed and supported experience. So I think if people want to find out more about that, the basic outline is there on the screen, but do dig in to find out more.
Roddy, if I can just jump in for 1 second, just to say that actually our inaugural program launches on the 29th of July, so this month. So we're really delighted to be launching this.
Yeah, so very soon, exactly. Brilliant. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to hear you and discuss these things. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much also to everybody who has joined us this afternoon and enjoyed your presentation and the discussion. And we look forward to having many of you back with us very soon.
Thanks, Roddy. Been a pleasure.
Thanks, Jonathan. Cheers. Bye.